So many cars, yet so few plugs. Welcome to the Urban EV Podcast, where we speak to industry leaders and EV owners with boots on the ground to read the tea leaves on the direction of the green energy revolution. I'm your host, Rob Hoffman.
And I'm Scott Murphy.
Today, we're joined by Steve Birkett, an EV advocate and marketer based in Boston, Mass. Steve is the founder of Plug and Play EV, a platform dedicated to educating consumers about electric vehicles and promoting sustainable transportation. He's helped thousands of EV drivers and the EV curious learn about electric vehicles, find the right model, and travel with confidence. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, guys. Appreciate you having me on.
So, Steve, tell us a little more about your background. You did not start out as an EV guy. What brought you to where you are today?
Sure. So I'm a marketer by trade, and the accent may give it away, although it's been hybridized over the years. I come from the UK originally, so I moved over to the States in 2009, started in your area, Rob, in New York City, and then eventually moved up to Boston. Background in B2B marketing mostly, so a lot of content creation, informative blogs, slowly moving into video. And that kind of paved the way to creating videos about electric vehicles through a passion project called Plug and Play EV, which started life as a YouTube channel, just kind of documenting the woes, I guess, of a Volt EV owner in the cold, frozen Northeast. Didn't know why my vehicle was charging slowly. Didn't know why a DC fast charger was 25 kilowatts at a dealership instead of the 50 I was supposed to get or plus. And that kind of thing just drove me to, there's a lot of content creators in Teslas at that time, a lot of content creators in kind of the sunny Southern California region where everything's, land of milk and honey for electric vehicles. But the Northeast is a different animal. And that kind of got me chronicling life, with a non-Tesla EV in that area. So that slowly formed after videos, kind of eventually kind of linked up with my day job at marketing, B2B marketing, and into the EV sector. And here we are today, kind of working with a lot of companies, EV charging, software companies, that kind of thing, to bring their message to industry, to EV drivers, the EV curious, and everything's pushing in the same direction. So that's my life now in 2025.
Wonderful. So what car are you driving today?
I would be driving a Hyundai IONIQ 5, but it's that may be something you want to go into. It just got the ICCU recall, and the fuse blew on it over days ago. So that's hot off the press here, and my car is suddenly in central Connecticut. So that's another saga for another day, perhaps. But daily driver, Hyundai IONIQ 5.
Do you have an ICE vehicle as the loaner right now, or are you still?
No, I get my loaner tomorrow, and because Boston is a nice little hotbed of electric vehicles, I can actually rent from Hertz and get pretty much my pick of EVs, so I should have some interesting content about that as well.
All right, so the IONIQ, though, is kind of like a focal point of your channel, right? I mean, how long have you owned it for, and why don't you talk to us more a little about the ownership experience other than the recall that just took place?
Sure. It's been largely really good. It's 2022 5, so first model year. So we all know the problems. Don't buy a first model year if you don't want to deal with some recalls and some time in the dealership. But it's largely been good. First 40,000 miles, more or less, were uneventful. We managed to go on trips around the Midwest and a lot of national parks, Great Smoky Mountains. Went up to Minnesota in 2023. So a lot of land where there was no real charging, but it does a good job, gets back on the road really quickly because of that 800-volt architecture, and charges in, 20, 25 minutes in really optimal conditions. So that's been great, really big upgrade from the Volt EVs that we had previously leased.
Was that how you got your start, though? What was your first entry into the EV world?
Yeah, I mean, technically it was a Chevy Volt with a V, so the extended range electric vehicle. That was more shared with my brother-in-law, so we kind of use that to dip our toes in the water, as so many people do, and so many people will do now, I guess, as we're kind of backsliding to EREVs a little bit. But that kind of got me confident that we could drive electric. It was more frustrating to run over into the gas part at that point and to run on combustion when the 40 miles or so of electric range ran out. The upgrade to the Volt EV, 2 leases from 2017 to 2020, and then 2020 to 2023. Those took us through to the IONIQ 5 eventually.
When did you realize, hey, I think there's something here. There's a lot more people out there like me. I think I need to spread the message here and share some insight. How did that take place, and when did that moment occur when you kind of transitioned over to a true advocate?
think 2018, 2019 was when I really realized that, these things were here to stay. I think that it coincided, the only real options at the time at my price point of that $40,000 kind of mark, which sounds a lot for a Bolt EV nowadays, but these were the options at the time, was that and the Tesla Model 3. We wanted a hatchback, so the Bolt was pretty much the only choice back then, at least one that went over 200 miles. And so at that point, it was a little bit precarious. You weren't sure if Tesla was going to make it. Seems insane to say now, but, they were kind of bordering on bankruptcy as they went
There
through
was a
that.
moment there. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's kind of, it seems odd to go that far back, but definitely 2018 as the Model 3 start to reach kind of, mainstream levels and volume production, and they made it over that hump. You knew that Tesla was going to kind of kick the door open and really threaten the traditional OEMs. General Motors with the Bolt EV and a few others were trying to start to say, we're going to go more electric, and there were more investments. So I think at that point, I realized that these were here to stay. And, somebody was going to need to cover these things in the Northeast because it's cold. And these things have their little vagaries. Still works perfectly fine. We've always had an EV as our only family car since 2018, essentially. So that was pretty much the year it kind of clicked, I think.
So what's the experience, and being that you're not a Tesla driver, and you've had to deal with the other charging networks, which we kind of cover on a regular basis here. I'm always kind of doing a smackdown on Electrify America. What's the experience like now in the Northeast compared to what it was in 2018?
It has got a lot better. I mean, there's really that's such a long time. There's a lot of phases in there, really. The 2018 to 2020, 21 was really the build out phase for Electrify America. I did journeys back in 2020 down to fully charged live in Texas from Boston, which, Electrify America is the only option other than dealerships and random little places in the back of, strange parking lots. So a lot of Walmarts, a lot of that build out at the time. I did have some showstoppers on that trip. I had to limp along on level 2 for a little bit. But those are really the pioneer kind of early days.
When you say showstoppers, you mean, did you get stranded?
Essentially, yeah. I don't know if anyone's in the region of New York, they'll know Herkimer is one of these old kind of, Electrify America stations at a Denny's that I actually expected the problems to be, I'd done that journey a lot from Boston to Ohio. That's my day-to-day kind of, family trip. So I was used to that bit. And then after that, I was worried because that's where you get into like your Arkansas, your Texas, and there's just nothing else. I would have been camping on, 240 volt level 2 RV parks. So that was where I placed most of my planning. And then the real, one where I had to limp along on level 2 because Electrify America failed me was in this Herkimer within 300 miles of starting the journey. I was like, this is probably going to go very badly at this point. Limped across New York State, managed to get to Ohio. And actually everything after that was pretty seamless. I mean, it was early days. There was not very much usage. As I say, you only really had about 9-10 models on sale. And most of those were either a Tesla or kind of short range EVs. So people weren't doing road trips like this very much. And aside from the very slow charging, which is, another thing that I guess we'll come on to, it was just fine. I got my rest, I got my travel down there, and Electrify America kind of worked fine. In the middle period there from 2020, I guess, as you got more like your ID4s, your Mach-E's, free charging plans starting to come out, so you get rideshare drivers clogging these things up in cities. It's another wave of Electrify America's growth that they just got hit repeatedly with a lot of utilization. I actually think there's a lot of different problems. I think California has its congestion problem. The middle of the country has its maintenance problems because they're old hardware that they couldn't get people out to fix because the people are based in cities, West Coast, East Coast, Chicago, and you've got to get these people out to maintain the things. And then the Northeast, I think, and the North in general has some problems with temperature. So you just got a lot of little problems, in different areas kind of piling up to this reputation that I'm sure you'll kind of attest to is not a great one for Electrify America in that kind of 22, 23, and maybe into 24.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that, because I do pretty much exclusively, my travel's been on the Northeast, and I've basically experienced a lot of negatives mixed in with some positives. Electrify America has been the network that's probably let me down the most. But, it's interesting to see the trajectory of the journey, and you've really managed with your road warrior status. You've kind of really experienced it all, and you are really more of a data guy as well. And that's why I love how you're covering all this here. We can see the evolution of where we've been and where we're going. And I think we can all agree we're not quite there yet, but it depends on your situation. That's specifically for road tripping, by the way. For local driving, it's a different ball of wax. So that doesn't really apply to this, but we are specifically talking about road tripping.
it's worth putting that peg in there just because we do get sucked into the DC fast charging side and the going, how can I go 1,000 miles? Most people don't do this. For everybody who's looking at it as a day-to-day vehicle or covering that kind of average 38 miles, whatever, a day that most people do as a commute or a local kids to soccer run, these things work great. If you have home charging, fantastic. We can talk about the situation in cities and that kind of thing with the curbside charging, and that's really another area of the industry we need to work on. But if you can charge at home, if you're doing mostly local trips, these things are absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, the irony here is I know we're sitting here harping on road trips, and it's such a small percentage of most people's usage. Obviously, there are plenty of road warriors out there, but the majority of drivers out there are driving locally and essentially never need to plug into a DC fast charger. And if they do, it's once or twice a year. But on that note, though, let's just stay on this topic just for a moment more. Let's talk about the NEVI program. It's really been in the news recently. Trump came in and he said, "Hey, we're killing. The EV mandate is over," and obviously, with all the federal funds frozen, and the NEVI in particular, the whole industry was in an uproar and seriously concerned about the future of the rollout of infrastructure. That being said, there has been guidance that shows that maybe the sky isn't falling and maybe things are going in the right direction. Secretary of Transportation Sean Duffy made a comment recently, said any NEVI obligations that have been currently made, contracts that have been signed, those are still going to be funded. So it seems like the money that's been earmarked and allocated is still going to go out. Can you fill us in or tell us a little more about your take on public versus private funding and where we're going right now?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of NEVI, we're at a strange place. As part of the wider funding battle, it's very much, the new administration came in, kind of kicked the doors down and said, everything freeze. That was across the board in a lot of places that I won't try and speak to because I'm not nearly qualified enough. But NEVI was a piece of that, and certainly it represents a previous administration program that, represented a lot of the things that the current administration is trying to rail against. So you can see why they would want to put that back in the bottle. A lot of the funds are already out the door, as you said. It really depends now on the states, because the projects that have been obligated, as they've called it, which is again a piece that has to be defined, and this is where it starts to go to courts and legal action. The money that's already out there, we've got, I think it was at the current day, 58 stations that have been energized, but there's another probably twice that at least under construction. Then there's some pre-construction and things that have been contracted. So you're probably talking into, 200, 300 sites over across the states once you get to, what has actually been awarded and, they've started to build, whether it's shovels in the ground or just contracts on paper. Those are the pieces that the secretary was talking about to actually fulfill and meet those obligations. The tone on that is a lot less, it's a lot more cautious than the kind of Trump-Musk side of things, where they're just like, we're canceling everything in a lot of different spheres because they know these court battles are coming, right? There's going to be legal action, but it really depends on the states. All this money is with the states. So you've got on one end of the spectrum, states that have really forged ahead, Texas, Ohio, New York, all have a lot of either stations in the ground already and energized or coming online very soon. Texas is the one that I'm most interested with there because it's obviously much more red than Ohio's kind of a purple state, and then New York is obviously blue. So you have a spectrum there, but Texas seems to be wanting to continue to build. It has a lot of Tesla awards there as well, so you get a really weird overlap with, Tesla.
It's a confused state right now. They don't know what they want to be, and it's the home of Musk, basically. They clearly do support his directive, and apparently they're really leaning into a lot of green energy over there, even though they are also the home of oil in the United States as well. It's the epicenter of the oil and gas industry. It's interesting to see their developments in particular.
Yep, for sure. So that's the one I'm watching, really. I think we know New York is going to forge ahead. They have the Evolve New York program, which I've always pointed out as a very kind of, well-developed, at least in terms of coverage and people running it who drive electric vehicles. They've bridged a lot of that state, Adirondacks up in the kind of north area.
I'm using those chargers on a regular basis.
Yeah, and I mean, there's not to say they're perfect. There's plenty of things that you could point to with older equipment. They've mixed vendors along the way. That's been a problem for some sites, but they've settled on the latest Electrify America hardware, for better or worse. It seems to be very reliable. The sites are looking at like 98, 99% uptime for most of the ports. You're talking about 1,000 chargers plus now across that network. Not all NEVI funded. This is obviously a mix of what they did before NEVI and what's come after. But it seems like for New York's perspective, they're going to keep forging ahead until someone tells them not to. And then there's other states like, say, Arkansas, which just, again, red state, they had a really good plan, 19 stations awarded. They just cancelled it yesterday, 2 days ago now, but said essentially even the ones that are awarded are cancelled, which that kind of goes to obligations. And, it really depends on the states at this point. If the state decides we don't want to do it, they can drag their feet and not build anything. There's going to be court orders and legal settlements for like Love's, for example, which has a lot of sites, Love's travel stops. They want to build these things, but they've been very hesitant to do so until they've got that funding. Whereas the likes of a Pilot Flying J, it's closing in on 150 locations nationwide. Only about 16 or 17 of those have NEVI funding. So it's a really small percentage of the network, to your point about public versus private investment. A lot of this was built out anyway. They just happened to say, right, we can get funds at that point, that site. And there are some good ones that have really bridged gaps, like up in northern Utah, there's a place called Snowville I drove through last summer. There's nothing there. This is one of those places you drive through, it says no gas, no restrooms, nothing. Get off here at your peril, here be dragons kind of things. If you look at sites going in like that, where there's now EV charging, even where there was no Tesla charging before, I don't think that would have been a site they would have prioritized with private investment. There's who's using that really on a day-to-day trip. That's there now. That's energized, helping EV drivers get from Idaho down into kind of the Salt Lake City Front Range area. So you can see the benefits of it. It's just, it's probably been overblown because it gets all the headlines, but really as a proportion of most of these networks' overall funding, it's a very small part compared to the private investment that they're putting in.
Yeah, it's all about cutting through the noise and discerning what the message really is, because it's so easy to twist things around. But speaking of federal funding versus states funding, Scott, I'm pulling in the conversation right now. Revel, your former employer, was just awarded by New York State $60 million to install 267 DC fast chargers in the New York City area. So that's one of these moments here where I feel like, as you mentioned, Steve, this is a state and federal government sort of partnership deal here. Everyone's got to be on board. But even if the federal government's not on board, the states still have the power to move the ball forward.
If they have the money, though, that's the big thing. If they have the money, because I think a lot of those state budgets were relying on federal funds, federal infrastructure funds to fund those state projects. I mean, I think the Revel dollars have been allocated already, and certainly the state of New York is massively pro-Revel for good reason. But yeah, it'll come down to whether or not those federal dollars are flowing back into the states.
And you know what? We've got the tax base. And to be honest with you, I'm curious if the congestion pricing, if some of those funds were earmarked from that fundraise as well. Yeah, we do have a lot of money here, but I think New York City in particular understands all of the taxis right now, all the Uber drivers, they're all electric now because they've incentivized them to purchase those vehicles. That's great for the environment. That's great for New Yorkers. But I can tell you this, at the DC fast charging stations, they're off in lines there. There are too many Uber drivers and not enough chargers.
I think that's been a big piece. I mean, you see that from the rentals that we've talked about, the Hertz kind of fiascos, and the basically these private companies just throwing electric vehicles and their fleets at the public infrastructure, which was already stretched to begin with. That's why I like what Revel's doing, because they kind of see this, I don't think they initially thought they were going to be in the charging game, necessarily. And
God knows he can tell you more about that. He was there during the evolution.
Please do, because it's such a change from there's a lot of these entities now, kind of like the IONIQ thing, where there's 8 OEMs just saying, we've got to build it ourselves. This stuff is not going to be controllable otherwise. But yeah, I'd love to hear kind of a little bit about that evolution, because it's kind of a fascinating way they found themselves having to build out their own infrastructure, but doing it really well by the looks of it from the outside.
Yeah, I mean, Revel started as an on-demand mobility company, right? Started in electric dockless mopeds in New York, DC, Austin, Texas, Oakland, and San Francisco. So their initial business and their main business when they launched was mopeds. They saw the adoption rate of mopeds in most of the cities outside of New York was extremely low. And so they knew they had to pivot into something else. But let's be clear, they moved into electric vehicle charging infrastructure to charge their own fleet of ride-hail vehicles. That was the main focus of that initial charging hub in Brooklyn. Obviously, again, it was going to be open to the public from the start. But when you have 1,000 Teslas that you need to keep charged for your ride-hail operation, that's exactly where this came from. And I think, Rob, the chargers that are going in at JFK, the chargers that are going in at LaGuardia, same story. Primary focus there for them is going to be keeping their ride-hail fleet charged. It remains to be seen if they stay in ride-hail. If you look at Uber, for example, 10% of the total revenue comes from New York City ride-hail. So yeah, it's definitely a place where money can be made. I think the difference with Uber, obviously, and what Revel is doing is you have owned vehicles and employed drivers. So very different unit economics there. But I think this is just a clear sign that they are not going to turn away from electric vehicle charging infrastructure. They're opening some charging stations on the West Coast this year. So it's definitely where they're going to continue to emphasize. I think it'll be interesting to see if they keep the ride-hail operation once the charging infrastructure becomes more profitable for them.
Well, I mean, that's a whole other thing with autonomy right now, because the CEO of Uber has already made public statements saying the future of Uber is autonomous driving, and their current drivers have no part of that future. He said the quiet part out loud. And that's something that Revel, who employs their drivers, you really have to wonder where they're going with this, because you mentioned the unit economics, and it's just going to be cheaper without a driver, whether it's Waymo, whether it's Tesla, or another. If they can dial in New York and it's safe and legal and they get official green light to deploy in New York State, in New York City, you can be sure that the driver's time here is going to be short-lived. They're going to remove them from the equation. That's unfortunate for the professional drivers that are working at Revel or for Uber or anywhere else. But I can't see how this is going any other way.
No, but that's been the thesis of Uber all along. Day one, they said the only way we're a profitable business is if we get rid of the drivers. So that's not news.
It's always been part of their game plan.
That's always been the plan from the start. They said, look, in the meantime, we'll make getting a taxi easier than it has been in the past. You can summon it with your phone now. But ultimately, the only way for them to be profitable is to get rid of the driver. And they've been saying that from day one. And that's why the focus, in my mind, on Uber profitability for all this time, it's like, why are we even paying attention? We're waiting for that moment of the robo-taxi. But Uber predicted that, ages and ages ago. I think now it's becoming closer to a reality. I think we're still very far away from that safely launching in a place like New York City. It's just too unpredictable. And the technology that makes it effective in a space like that is just too complicated to put in a car right now. You need so much processing power. You need so many sensors to make that safe in New York City. It's going to be very difficult. And listen, I say this as someone with 10 years in emergency medical services in New York City. The city is incredibly unpredictable. And the things that happen in the streets, you can't even imagine, the level of unpredictability. So launching in some place like New York City, it's going to be very, very challenging. But look, that's the future, right? That and urban air mobility. I think even something that will happen much sooner than Uber having autonomous cars in New York City will be the widespread advent of urban air mobility, in whatever shape that takes. But I see that as coming much quicker than fully autonomous vehicles.
It is.
In a city like New York.
It's still only going to serve a very small percentage of the population, because the vertiport situation, you just can't put landing pads willy-nilly all throughout New York City. There's really going to be a finite amount of places to land. I think it's going to help people get to the airport, which is certainly the mission of Ubers and taxis.
Well, but Rob, remember where the first vertiport in New York City was?
You talking about on top of the Pan Am building?
On top of the Pan Am building. And the only reason that failed was, human being pilots. Other factors were involved, of course, like weather and things like that. But
it was actually a failed landing gear that actually caused that accident.
Yeah, and the rotor blade separation didn't hurt either. But
that was what happened afterwards. Either way, it was a horrible accident. And, I remember as a child that making news, and that was the end. That was it.
Yeah, that was it.
They shut down that heliport, and that Jetsons concept of taking off from the building you're working in was over. But we'll see. Me and Scott are both, we're both aviators. We have our background in aviation, so we're truly rooting for that. So that's a great bet to see which one comes first, the eVTOL vertiport or the autonomous car. They're neck and neck right now.
If you ask the autonomous car guys, they all say the eVTOL vertiport will come first. So, look, I think the other thing that will affect that tremendously is things like crosstown travel, in particularly in New York City. But you look at places like LA, the accessibility of downtown LA with placement of vertiports will be massive. If you look at all of the, rooftops of parking garages, even in New York City, there's going to be plenty of opportunities for for vertiports. But I think getting back to kind of what Steve's doing, Steve, I'm curious, like, obviously as this tech becomes more simplified, and we always talk about, Rob's an early adopter. He's really into the techie side of things and the planning. How do you think the role of like the types of content that you're creating helps to, simplify and maybe democratize the idea of owning an EV more and really get through the overly techie language and really get down to getting more regular people into EVs?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm the best person for that. There are definitely some really good channels out there. Tyler, the average EV, literally has it in his name that he's just the average EV driver trying to, commonize this stuff. Then there's a guy who just moved up here to Boston, Corbin, at the IONIQ Guy channel. I think he does a great job of kind of zeroing in on the models, particularly. He does EGMP content really well, just kind of explaining every little ins and outs of the platform, the vehicle. So I think there's a spectrum really of content creators. My focus has been more on road tripping and getting out there, being able to use the stations, figuring out how to plan a route, understand which vehicle you have is going to charge in which kind of scenario, because Teslas are quite easy, but you need to know that in the upper half of that battery pack, 50 to 100%, it's going to be a bit of a slow going compared to the first half. Whereas in our EGMP cars, Rob, we have the benefit of just kind of, they go to work, they'll go to town as fast as they can, as long as the battery is nice and toasty. And they're much more reliable to plug in at 60%, 40%, 10%. You're still going to get a good charge as long as the battery's in good shape. But I think that kind of thing, especially the cold weather, understanding, doing tests to say this is what the battery conditioning actually looks like. Because, for example, you need to warm up the pack to a kind of what humans are comfortable at, 70 to 80 degrees. That's where it really wants to be in order to get the best charging, the kind of 10 to 80% in 18 minutes that the IONIQ 5 boasted from day one. And that kind of thing, actually testing it out and saying, well, what does that mean in real life? If it's 40 degrees, great. That's probably just press the battery preconditioning button and off it goes, and you get a nice warm battery pack. But if it's, as it is this week, 10, 15 degrees, that can take 40, 50 minutes.
40 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah. So they need to know this kind of nuance of it, because I think there's still a lot of this, right, well, I'll press the battery preconditioning button, off it goes, or I'll warm it up and navigate to a charger. But if that charger is only 10 minutes away, you drive to it and then wonder why you're getting, 70, 80 kilowatts instead of the wonderful 240, 250 that you're used to in summer. That's the kind of thing people like to see, I think. And some people don't like videos so much. Some people prefer text. Podcasts, always great, right? So audio stuff you can listen to in the car whilst you're driving to the charger to get a slow charge.
To give you guidance.
Yeah, pretty much. And I mean, there's all this kind of content, but I think it's, there's a spectrum of creators out there now, which maybe wasn't the case early on, as people have come across and experienced the things in their own, day-to-day use that they're like, well, there's no real barriers. We know now you can, pull out your phone and film a segment. You can get, a really decent camera from just a handheld, an action cam, an Osmo 3, whatever. All that stuff is easy to get access to, upload a video and share what you're experiencing with the world. Doesn't mean we're experts, just means we have a desire to share the experience and kind of problem solve, in real time with people. So I think that's where the content really connects and starts to help people understand different models, the capabilities, why they might choose this model over a Tesla, or why the Tesla supercharger network is the only one they can go for if they're in a certain part of the country. All that stuff, I think, tends to be resonant with people.
Yeah, and I think right now, me being a private pilot, part of the process which I loved about flying is the pre-flight planning. You can't just get in an airplane, turn the key, and just take off. There's a lot that goes into making sure whether it's fuel, pre-flight, inspection of the airplane, route planning. You do all of that stuff when you fly. And I kind of love that about the EVs as well. You have to do that as well, but maybe that's not a good thing, because not everyone's like me. As Scott always mentions, I like geeking out on this stuff. Steve, I believe you do as well. But most people, I always bring my wife as example. She doesn't. She wants to get in the car, turn the key, go where she's going, and not think twice about it. And as you mentioned here about, even preconditioning the battery, well, you need to do it then, but here you do it in this instance, but you have to do it much sooner. And if you don't, things will be slower. EGMP platform, well, that's a great steady rate of charge here, but Tesla is going to peak fast and drop down. There's a lot going on here, and I still think that EVs in general need to simplify the message, whether it's through more automation within the car. It's got to do more of the thinking. It's got to be presented more, and just a sort of dumbed down version of the car does a lot of this stuff in the background without you having to think about it. I do believe it's surmountable. I'm sure of it, actually, but we're not quite there yet. And this is the reason why the early adopters like me and you are enjoying this and really are in need to create this content to guide people along. But once again, this is mostly for road tripping. If you're driving locally, none of this matters. None of it. It's actually the opposite. It's the most simple process ever, that you just pull into your driveway, pull into your garage, plug in overnight. Every time you leave in the morning, you have a full state of charge. And
Yeah,
you don't
but
think
Rob,
twice about it.
that's
You
not the
never
case
stop
with
guessing.
you.
It is not the case with
No,
me.
you're an
No,
everyday driver, and it's definitely not the case with you. Like,
well, because I'm a public charger as well.
yeah, well, and you
'cause
live in
I
a
use
major
public-
city. But like we talked about, I think it was a couple of episodes ago when I looked at the charging infrastructure in my neighborhood in Islington in London, you could behave exactly that way in Islington in London, in the center of busy London, because there's curbside charging infrastructure. And that was going to be kind of my next question for Steve. How do you see that evolving in the U.S.? How do you see the lack of available grid infrastructure impacting that? And what do you think, comparing that to the UK, when do you think the States will catch up? Because Rob has a very different experience. He's painting a very simple picture, but his day-to-day life is not that easy.
Yeah, I mean, I think where I'm based, I'm in suburban Greater Boston. If that's pretty vague, but it's driveways and people have their own charging. But I only have to go 2 towns down, Cambridge, Somerville, and then the city of Boston itself to see exactly what situation Rob's in. But there are, from these kind of conversations, literally there are people spawning businesses in your backyard. Really, It's Electric, I think, is down in Brooklyn,
Yes.
in the Navy Yard down there. So they're kind of bringing a solution to market that is very like what Scott's referencing in London. Hey, bring your own cable behind the meter scenario, which is a very small outlet, really, just a post and an outlet that fits in with the regular street furniture of a place like New York City, where there's a lot of that. And that it's still the problem is with a lot of these, and they're not problems, they're just very early on. These people are kind of bringing their solutions to market now. They've gone through the design phases in 21, 22, 23 a little bit, got funding, and they're in a place where they can start installing these things. The good thing is that cities tend to be quite supportive of that. So like we said, New York City will have that funding one way or another. Boston will have the funding for these pilots one way or another. San Francisco, Los Angeles. So all of these solutions are going to get some support regardless of what happens in the wider industry. There's that. There is a solution called Volt Post, which is kind of a retrofit onto existing street lighting, which is a really interesting solution. They've got pilot money as well in New York and around the East Coast. I'm trying to think.
Unfortunately for Volt Post in New York City, I know that all the streetlights are like single phase electricity, and you need 2-phase electricity for level 2 charging. So I know there's a bit of a challenge there from an infrastructure standpoint.
I think that's why they're going with so many different types, because there's probably 4 or 5 providers that typically turn up. In Boston did this with 3 different providers, and It's Electric, kind of bring your own cord solution, Volt Post's kind of solution, retrofitting existing infrastructure, and then more traditional chargers that are just the kind of flow chargers that you see in New York City.
Yeah, we have those. Those are the ones that I use, actually.
Yeah. So that's coming to Boston as well. A lot of these cities are just trying to start figuring it out. So there's going to be solutions. There's going to be some that go bust, that just didn't kind of work out. But I do see that kind of model that Scott's kind of highlighted in London. I've been there a couple of times, same in Paris. There's just a lot of these. It wasn't even like me trying to seek them out as an EV nerd. It was just walking to the events that I was going to with my son. So, there's a, tiny little box car plugged in over there, or there's somebody draping a cable, across the street. So not all of it's elegant. Some of it will need to be refined, but I think we're so early on here in that deploying that in the US. It's still pilot phase. So that kind of makes me feel like it's probably 3-4 years away before some of these things start to gain real kind of widespread traction.
Yeah, and just really quick about It's Electric, just to do a quickie deep dive on them. I'm really bullish on their concept. It's almost like crowdsourcing electricity. What they don't need, obviously, I'm sure they still need the support of some funding, but what they do is they work with building owners throughout the city and say, hey, you have excess electricity. We're going to come in. If you're interested, we'll tap into that. We'll put some sort of metering device on there, a distribution device where we're never going to pull more electricity than is available. and we're going to put these fire hydrant sized posts in front, bring your own cable. Anyone that parks in the public spot in front of you can tap in, and we share the profits. I'm really bullish on that, and I think that is not as reliant on public funding. And in the end, it's a win-win situation for the building owners, for It's Electric, for the drivers, for everyone. So I think they have a really good shot of going mainstream. But I agree with you there, Steve. In best case scenario, it's going to still take quite a few years until they really, truly deploy.
There's also, I mean, it's too much to go into here, but that's just something to people to have on their radar is, battery costs plummeting, falling really quickly. There's a lot of distributed energy resources, kind of storage. Think Tesla Powerwalls on, a bigger scale for apartment buildings, multifamily dwellings, especially in cities. Having that kind of LFP battery in place as both a something to charge vehicles for level 2, maybe move demand around a little bit for when power is cheaper, bridge gaps, as Scott was talking to limited power and capacity of buildings. There's potential there, but again, it's all in this kind of, it's really exciting technology and potential, but it's so early on and there's so many pilots, it's hard to say when or if that will really kind of come to fruition, but it's something to watch because battery prices really are tumbling at the moment.
I agree. It's something here where this book is still being written right now. All right, let's shift gears for a moment. Let's get into rapid fire question and answer round here. We're going to take a step back from the numbers right now. What's the biggest myth about EVs that drives you crazy?
I think the winter story is the worst. It's obviously we lose a bit of range and the batteries don't like it in the cold, but they are so good. Electric vehicles are so good in the cold. My IONIQ 5 is an all-wheel drive. It's low slung. The kind of the floor wheelbase is spread out a little bit. It drives like a tank in the snow, and I've heard this of others. Acura ZDX, a bunch of Honda Prologue. Just the low weight of that battery and the even distribution. They drive so well if you have the right kind of, all-wheel drive model in the snow. My wife literally took the IONIQ 5 over a Tesla, despite the charging infrastructure differences, for a trip to the Midwest recently, through West Virginia even, which is the land that charging forgot, to be able to, have that all-wheel drive and drive confidently in the snow. So that driving characteristics in them in winter are fantastic, and you can precondition the cabin from the wall, get all that snow melted off. They're actually really good to own in winter, just you have to be aware of the charging kind of limitations.
Yeah, you do take a dent there in range. My response always when someone makes that claim about, oh, what about them driving in the winter? I have a one-word answer, that's Norway. 95% adoption over there. So,
they can do it.
They must be doing something right in the snow. Okay, so if you could own one EV, past, present, or future, probably more like present or future. I don't think there's that many in the past that we're going to have to worry about. What would it be?
Tough to pick one. Dream car would probably be a Taycan. I forget now what it is, but the elongated one in one of those racing green colors. That's always been ridiculously lovely, but not practical for a family man. And so if I move to the family side, probably a Rivian 1S at the moment.
Yeah, the Rivians are really sweet. I agree with you there. I think it's, I have a Kia EV9, which is a family hauler, third row. I actually really like it a lot. But yeah, if price was no object, I'd be in the Rivian as well. Okay, so what's the most exciting EV-related tech that you're really high on right now?
I hate to put it out there because it's been the latest EV tech for the last 10 years, but solid-state batteries seem to actually have some traction now. I'm always worried about that.
I knew you were going to say
5
that.
years away. But Hyundai actually just had some headlines recently about starting to prototype a production version of the solid state tech. So as much as I hate to do it because I've been so critical of some of those headlines, especially from Toyota over the years, I think that's the one that unlocks a lot of range and capacity and it's been in the pipeline for so long that somebody has some magic somewhere in there, I think.
And last but not least, what is your dream EV road destination?
I've done a few of them.
You've been everywhere. Maybe you've already been there. Maybe there are
that's
no
the
more
problem.
dreams
I've
left.
done about half the country, so I have to, just to fill in the map, I have to do a trip along I-40 through the south. I've done the north and over to the west coast, but I should really do somewhere in the southeast all the way over to SoCal and make that trip a reality at some point. Other than that, maybe Trans-Canada Highway.
Steve, it's a real pleasure having you on the show here. Why don't you tell the audience where we can find you online and Plug and Play EV?
Yeah, so the website is plugandplayev.com. That's just kind of home for everything. On YouTube, if you just search Plug and Play EV, the videos will come up, and there's various road trips there. It's probably the best. I'm also pretty active on LinkedIn, so just type Steve Birkett into your search bar, and you'll be able to find my latest data posts, whatever else is of interest to you. All that stuff is a good place to connect.
Well, once again, Steve, thank you so much for being on the show. A reminder to the listeners at home to follow us as well on LinkedIn. We're pretty active over there. Like, subscribe to the podcast, and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Your review or feedback is always appreciated. Any other subjects you'd like us to cover, just leave it in the comments below. We will see you next week with a new episode of the Urban EV Podcast.